A few weeks ago, PragerU released a video on the former Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Now, was there any mention of the fact that Thatcher doubled unemployment and massively increased poverty? No, of course not. We were instead given a puff piece where Neil Ferguson, a prominent right-wing historian, claimed that Maggie saved Great Britain. Yes, this PragerU video is a fine demonstration of emotional claptrap taking precedence over historic facts. Truly a video for the modern conservative. Anyway, let's begin.
If you think the world is a mess now, that just means you weren't around in the 1970s. In Britain, where I grew up, the low point was known as the Winter of Discontent, a line borrowed from Shakespeare's Richard III. The inflation rate in 1975 was 27%. The trains were always late, the payphones were always broken, nothing worked. Worst of all were the recurrent strikes. Strikes by coal miners, strikes by dockers, strikes by printers, strikes by refuse collectors, strikes even by gravediggers. It felt as if there was no way back.
And of course, Ferguson starts with the 1970s, the decade that supposedly justifies Thatcher's impoverishment of the working class. Now, whilst it was a time of high inflation and relative inefficiency, it was also a time where workers' share of the national income was at its highest and unemployment was relatively low. Furthermore, in the late 70s, before Thatcher came to power, there was optimism because North Sea oil was starting to boost Britain's fortunes. Inflation had been cut in half, and the economy was growing at a reasonable pace.
And then came Margaret Thatcher. Between May 1979, when she entered 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, and November 1990, when she stepped down, she changed everything.
Indeed, she threw millions out of work and into poverty, ruining their lives. Now, this is even more shocking when you consider that the recovery of the British economy in the 1980s was inevitable. Oil from the North Sea is what saved Britain, not Thatcher, who simply just squandered the money on tax cuts and maintaining the unemployed she created. To give you an idea how lucky she was, in 1978, the last full year of the Callaghan Labour government, oil revenue was £565 million. In 1984, it was £12 billion. A massive increase. Now imagine if Britain had a decent government, a government that chose to invest this oil money in infrastructure and new industries. Those who would use the resources created from this massive windfall to improve the lives of workers, rather than impoverish them like Thatcher did. Britain would be a far better place than it is today. If the waste of North Sea oil money, which Ferguson does not mention in this video, does not convince you that Thatcher was a complete incompetent and a disaster, then nothing will.
As early as 1975, Thatcher had come up with a wonderful line about the opposition Labour Party. They've got the usual socialist disease. They've run out of other people's money.
Sickening hypocrisy. Thatcher squandered one of the biggest windfalls in British history. Even Michael Heseltine, one of Thatcher's ministers, pointed this out, stating that the money should have been invested rather than wasted on tax cuts. Also, how do you think the state would have sustained the unemployed without the oil boom? The country would have collapsed into a heap. The fact that conservatives pretend that Thatcher was somehow prudent with money is outrageous. A victory of spin over substance.
This she contrasted memorably with what she called the British inheritance. A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master.
Except if you were a worker. Thatcher used the power of the state to beat the trade union movement into submission, using both the police and legislative power to gravely weaken the working class movement. For example, the Employment Act of 1980 outlawed sympathy and solidarity strikes. This meant that, say, if there was a train driver strike, it was forbidden for teachers and nurses to join them in solidarity. So the strikes you are seeing in France today would be impossible in Britain. Furthermore, through doubling the unemployment rate, she turned more than 1 million workers into dependents, who relied on state dole payments to survive, taking away their bargaining power and their dignity. So Thatcher, despite her rhetoric, restored the state as master and stripped away power from organised labour, an action of an authoritarian.
This was the essence of Thatcherism, and it was just the tonic that the patient, the British economy, needed. It's fashionable nowadays to argue that there was no Thatcher miracle in the 1980s. Not only is that demonstrably false, it misses an essential point. Thatcherism wasn't just about raising productivity or creating jobs. Just as important was the goal of defeating inflation and restoring prosperity to the middle class. This it emphatically achieved.
I find it sad that Ferguson, a rather prominent historian, would stoop this low. As I have pointed out in this video, Thatcher presided over the highest level of unemployment since the Great Depression. How is that creating jobs? Furthermore, inflation had already fallen from 25% to 12% by the time Thatcher came to office. And of course, what is most damning is that she created an underclass. The percentage of people living below the poverty line rose from 13.4% to 22.2%, whilst the share of all income received by the 1% in Britain took off. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. That was the result of Thatcher's tonic, saving the rich capitalists from the working class.
Yet the event that more than any other defined Margaret Thatcher's premiership was not economic, but military. The Falklands War against Argentina established her irrevocably in the public mind as the new Britannia, a warrior queen who gloried in victory. And of course it ensured a Conservative win in the 1983 election.
Ah yes, the Falklands War. Why do you think Thatcher's supporters never mention why the Argentinians thought they could take the islands? Well, in 1981, Thatcher's government decommissioned the only armed ship, the HMS Endurance, in the South Atlantic and implemented the 1981 Nationality Act, which denied Falklanders British citizenship. Now what kind of message do you think that sent to Argentina? That the Thatcher government did not care about the islands. Islands that had been disputed territory since the 19th century. So the Argentinian junta, whose Thatcherite economic policies had also resulted in mass poverty and unemployment, decided to invade the islands, thinking that such a win would be a boost to their fortunes at home. So it was largely Thatcher's government's fault that Argentina invaded in the first place. The claim that she should be congratulated for retaking the islands after she lost them is beyond ridiculous.
Not without reason did a Soviet magazine nickname Thatcher the Iron Lady. Along with her ideological soulmate, US President Ronald Reagan, she was unhesitating in her opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, she fully supported, despite fierce opposition, Reagan's countermove to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to Western Europe.
Oh, so she was a good US puppet. What a stunning achievement.
It's still terribly hard for those who opposed her to admit it. But Margaret Thatcher was right about most things. She was right that the British trade unions had become much too powerful. She was right that inefficient nationalised industries had to be privatised. And she was right that the West could win the Cold War.
And that is the conservative mindset in a nutshell. Putting trade unions in their place and destroying their industries is far more important than employment, poverty reduction, housing and healthcare. What a joke. Now here is the truth of the matter. Thatcher massively increased poverty, squandered an oil boom on tax cuts, presided over record bankruptcies, destroyed British manufacturing and doubled unemployment. It's time for Conservatives to grow up and admit that her government was an economic and social disaster.